Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Thursday the 8th of January. Before I do the introduction, I should extend a special welcome to Sir John Whittingdale, who's guesting from the FCDO committee, and Damien Hines, Right Honourable Damien Hines, who's guesting from DCMS committee. So a very warm welcome to you too. The BBC World Service provides crucial services for impartial and independent news programming globally, bringing in a weekly audience of over 300 million across 43 languages. The World Service is funded by a combination of the BBC licence fee and grant funding from Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, with a budget of 358 million in the year 25-6. Since 2022, the BBC World Service has made savings of around 50 million, following reductions to the BBC's licence fee income. These are mainly made through closures of TV and radio platforms. Inevitably, audience numbers have fallen over this period, now around 14%, or 52 million less than 21-2. So today's session will be an opportunity to challenge the BBC on its approach to planning the World Service savings programme, as well as plans to make improvements for the future. We will also be examining plans of how the BBC will sustain public trust in its services. So we are very pleased to have a senior team from the BBC with us today. And of course, Tim Davie, the Director General, is well known to everybody. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself and your colleagues introduce themselves, please?
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and I welcome your opening remarks, and we look forward to the discussion. I always prefer my colleagues to introduce themselves in a way, because I think it's worth you hearing from them. So, Jonathan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you for hosting us. I'm Jonathan Munro. I'm the Interim CEO of BBC News. Substantively, I'm the Global Director of BBC News, but you may know that we've had some management changes recently, so I'm covering the CEO's role. And Fiona is covering my role, so I'll let you introduce yourself, Fiona.
Introduce yourself, Fiona. A warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Fiona Crack. I am the Interim Global Director, which has responsibility for the World Service, filling in for Jonathan while he does his role.
Great, very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Well, a special warm welcome to Fiona and Jonathan, because this is your first time, I think, before the committee. So a special welcome to you. Right, to start us off with our questions, I think we go straight to Rupert Lowe, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I think I should probably declare a conflict of interest to start with, in that I've had 3 complaints upheld against the BBC in the last 12 months. So I probably, in case anyone thinks that makes me biased, I probably ought to disclose that. I wondered, I think the question I've got is for Tim. Tim, have you actually all read the NAO report in full, and do you agree with it?
Absolutely. No, I've read it in full, because working with the NAO, and I thank the NAO for the report. We've actually, I think over the course of the last few years, we really worked very hard to get our operational delivery and grip to a different level, and the NAO is helpful. I certainly don't think we're sitting there, if I may, trying to in rebuttal mode in the slightest. What I would say is I've read all the report fully. Obviously, I've got some support here in terms of some of the detail if we get to the real grip of the individual savings plans and where we're at. We fully agree with the analysis. There are bits where we would say, okay, there's some learnings there. We might have a gentle pushback in terms of how the process worked. But overall, we agree with it. And I think if you step back from it, what it says at a top-line CEO level, first thing I'd say is these are we should talk about it, I'm sure we will, in terms of the tough, whatever the word is, envelope for the finances of the World Service. I happen to think that we are at a very, very important point in the UK in making decisions or in investing in services such as the World Service, soft power and our position in the world, that we can talk about that. But what this says is under very, very tight financial constraints, I think we made some tough decisions. The BBC has a strong record and grip. It's got some good people who know how to deliver savings plans, and you'll see we are slightly behind, but we'll deliver those 54 million of savings as part of, if I may say, 700 million of savings across the BBC that are well tracked. But what the NAO does, and I think it's right, is it is pretty it's pretty tough on us, and I think rightly, in terms of some of the documentation, the process by which you analyse some of those decisions. Now, I think some of those discussions were, as you would recognise in business, you have those discussions. Sometimes I think we can do a bit better job, bluntly, and being very open about it, in terms of some of the documentation. But the overall results and what we did, I think we made good decisions under extremely tough circumstances. I think we will and can get under the numbers in terms of some of the declines, which relate to other factors as well, such as Facebook algorithms. They're not just the so-called cuts, they're how the world is moving. But overall, read the report, supportive of the NAO's conclusions. Thank you.
So when we see in the report, however, these business cases did not meet NAO identified good practice, they lacked options analysis, had poorly developed risk assessments, and in some places contained inaccuracies. You then come on to the service's monitoring of its savings progress was hampered by the complexity of its finance system. It therefore relied on estimates instead of actual information. And you read, in addition, the BBC's whistleblowing team identified issues with poor quality documentation and analysis to support key decisions in phase one of the service's savings programs. I mean, in a private business, if you read a report like this, you'd sort of think, well, we're flying blind. So I mean, question. I mean, how can you be confident that you actually did make the right decisions when the quality of the data that you appear to have been basing those decisions on is arguably deficient?
If I may, having been in the private sector for a decade and plus, and been involved in a few, I think what it says is not quite flying blind, or far from it. What it says is the documentation and the way some of the decisions were made didn't meet the NAO's best practice. That's slightly different, if I may. There's plenty.
You've got to accept that some of this is quite critical.
And I do. No, it's the level of criticism and how we react to it and how we improve reacting to, rather than and how we describe the scale of the issue. I'm not being defensive about it. I'm just trying to present a fair picture. I've said to you, I've totally taken I agree with the analysis, but what you said is flying. But I don't believe it's flying blind. The BBC's never short of paperwork. Okay, I've tried.
Too much paperwork can be confusing, can't
correct.
it?
And I can actually give you one of the things I've done over my tenure is reduce the amount of paper flying around the BBC. The issue is the actual standard and formats, and risk registers discuss what format you want. Yeah, what the NAO have done and the team have done quite rightly, I think, is said we have best practice in certain areas. So it's not as if we didn't look at risk, or of course the team were looking at options. They're concerned, like everyone around this committee, if you're trying to find money, where do you do it with least impact? They were looking at particular audience metrics. I'll give you some specifics. So they were looking at audience metrics, very carefully at options. But in terms of, could we have recorded that more carefully? Could the quality of documentation been better? Yes, agreed. We have some learnings. The BBC actually, for all its dramas, literal and metaphorical, is actually got a very good record, I think, in the last 5 years of delivering on plan to the numbers it commits to in its savings plans. It has a level of operational rigour and efficiency, which I'm proud of. Very proud of, actually. If you came to the BBC and met the people, the project management, they know their business. Now, as CEO, I look at it overall and say, we are delivering on the saving plan. It's slightly late, and I think in a commercial operation, that would be your prime concern alongside your overall metrics.
Well, I'm not sure it's necessarily the prime concern, Tim, because I think the key is you can deliver the savings, but the question is, I think the NAO is asking, and I think it's a valid question, is what are the downstream effects of those cuts? And it doesn't appear that you necessarily have the management tools to be able to make that call.
Right, and I'll let the team talk.
I think that's what they're saying, isn't it? So I think making the cuts is always easy. The question is, what damage is making the cuts doing?
I think that is a fair observation. And I think the truth is that we've had quite some considered thinking about how this affects, sensibly making those decisions. But what the NAO bring helpfully, and I'm the first to say, because you know as well as I do, you can always improve these somewhat significantly to say, are we completely clear about the forecasting, the risks involved? Last point I'd make before I hand to the team is, I think we're in an incredibly difficult world to forecast, by the way. So I think you can do all the maybe it's because I'm towards the end of my tenure, I'm slightly more untethered, but it's like, I think all the forecasts.
Just because you're in a difficult world doesn't mean you don't try and forecast.
No, of course you. No.
On that basis, nobody bother with the budget.
No, but I'm not lurching to that position, if I may. I'm saying that when you had years of inflation popping to 30% in markets, when you had the amount of conflicts that we've had to deal with, that is quite difficult. Now, to your point, I agree with you. That can be forecast risk a proper, and what the NAO brought to us is saying, look, you could do a better job of some of that risk assessment. And I agree with you. There's things we could do.
So the question that follows on from that, Tim, it doesn't sound as if you have fully necessarily taken on board what the NAO has said. The question, I think...
Sorry, can I ask you why you don't sense that?
The question for Jonathan is, what are you now doing to change as a result of this report, if you accept this report as valid and having veracity?
Which we do, of course, and I echo everything Tim said about that, and thank you for picking it back up on the question. Just to build on Tim's points and then come to your point about what we're doing now in terms of our processes. The period relevant to the NAO report, which is 2022 onwards for 3 financial years, we took about 14% of our costs out, plus the effect of inflation. So that's a considerable chunk of our money, and we're delivering all of those savings by about 2 months from now. The turn of the financial year coming up will have delivered them all. So there's a time lag compared to what we hoped to do, but the savings will all come out. That time lag is caused, I think, by a number of things. There are clearly lessons in the paperwork process, benchmarking, which are identified, as you rightly say, in the NAO report, and we agree with all of the points that the team have made there. But there are other factors which I think are sort of slightly less dry, and they're important to bring into the room. So, as Tim mentioned, we talk a lot about costs relative to previous budgets, and we often talk about real terms rises or cash flat rises, and we're talking then about the relative settlement for UK inflation purposes. UK inflation is a pretty minor factor in World Service forecasting, so we do forecast for these things, but when you have a global inflation peak, which in 3 of our key markets pushed inflation in Lebanon, where we have a significant base in the period relevant to the NAO report, to 45%, 38% in Egypt, 30% in Nigeria. Very few businesses have got enough elasticity, particularly when you're spending and accountable for public money, to really forecast for that inflationary surge. So inevitably we had to move some money around in the 3-year period in order to ensure that we weren't taking money out of the front line of coverage. Secondly, the beginning of this period coincided almost bang on with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That was a massive story. Now, stories are what we do, and it's reasonable to say, well, surely you forecast for news stories, and we do that. But when the news story results in having to lift and shift the whole of the Russian language service from Moscow to Riga for their own safety, their own legality, that's a very significant cost. It also makes it almost impossible at the same time to deliver a structural saving against a preordained timeline, because it might be the right thing to do, but the wrong time to do it. So those are factors that mean that the elasticity of our budget planning just has to be a little bit more fluid than perhaps in a less volatile business. And the third factor, and this is also important to your point about future proofing the system, all of the 3 years were subject to 1 year by year funding settlements from the Foreign Office. That is actually no way to run a long-term business strategy. We're sitting here on January the 8th, is it? We still don't have our budget settlement for the new financial year from April, which is less than 3 months away. Right. So getting budget planning in time relies on a number of things that are out of our control to be true. Luckily, we think we're moving to a place with the FCDO, with whom we have an excellent relationship, by the way, for a longer-term budget settlement, and we would really welcome that. That would make it a lot easier to deliver against forecasts. On the point you asked specifically, Mr. Lowe, about changes to processes now, we've had access to some of the NAO's findings now for quite a considerable number of weeks. We've read them all, we've digested them all, and we are working now to change some of the specific points that they identify in their report, for example, around business planning, paperwork, templates, those sorts of things, the backroom functions, which enable us to report more accurately, but will always be vulnerable to the news agenda and to unexpected events.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I mean, Chairman, I've got a question here on the complexity of your finance system. I'm finding it difficult to understand why your finance system is so complex. I'd like to know why that is. I mean, after all, your actual business model isn't that complicated. You send out 72 million letters a year to collect the licence fee from those people who haven't paid. Very often they're old people who are being chased. They're quite aggressive letters. It doesn't seem to me that accounting for a monopoly should be that difficult, because your income side of the equation is quite straightforward. It's not like running a contracting business where you've got work in progress, you've got all sorts of variables. Your funding largely comes from the licence fee payer, and I accept for the World Service some of it now, and 31% increase last year from the FCDO, and it looks like you're going to get more from the FCDO again this year. That's still taxpayers' money.
Of course.
So that's not money you have to go and earn. That's actually money that comes in, and I accept the fact they haven't agreed it yet, and it's remiss of them not to have done that. But I'm struggling to understand why your finance system is so complicated, because a complicated and opaque finance system means it's very difficult to make good decisions. So can you explain to me why it's so complicated?
Yeah, I'll make one point. Complicated is one thing, opaque is another, by the way. Complicated is what we're talking about.
Complex systems mean
Can
opaque data.
Can live to the opaque risk, I'll tell you.
So I think,
Can I just make one point on
course.
the revenue? Totally agree with you. I mean, this is in some ways a simple business model with regards to the licence fee.
I would have thought so, but
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
We don't even need to argue about that. That it is we have some debates about the enforcement, but that model in itself is simple. I would say, remember, however, if you look at the overall BBC revenue, we have a very successful, and I'm very proud of it, £2 billion commercial arm. So we have that revenue coming into the system, the dividends from that, we have a high functioning board in terms of how much revenue we take from the commercial arm versus investment classic stuff that you'd be across. Then you have the World Service funding. So it is a little bit of a stitch together before we get to the complications which you can address in terms of day-to-day management of financing across currencies, across business models, across freelancers. I mean, the idea that isn't complex of itself. There is a degree of complexity having run commercial organisations that is there. It's not just simple as, get the licence fee in and spend it when it comes to international and global operations. I've got your point, by the way, and it's a fair one. It's actually one of the things that's enabled us to go after savings so clearly, which is one thing we're blessed with, is the long-term some degree of certainty over revenue, and the simple nature of the licence fee allows you to plan for the long term and do the right things for the UK. Now, in terms of the day-to-day operations, you might want to just give a flavour of across multiple currencies with different business models, with the commercial revenues coming in. It's not quite as clean as you're talking in terms of the challenge for the finance teams.
I mean, I'd love a simpler finance system, to be clear. And I should, by way of disclaimer, I don't think any of us here are accountants by trade, but clarity of accounting would be very welcome, is very welcome. It's quite complicated in the World Service, in truth. As you suggest, and you're right, the licence fee accounts for, roughly speaking, about 2/3 of World Service budgets right now. It was more than that, but the government, as you say, increased the what was called grant in aid allowance in the last financial year, and as you just discussed, we're awaiting the next settlement. There are also other relatively minor income streams, but they're not irrelevant to the complexity point that you make. So, for example, a lot of our broadcast products are carried by partner broadcasters around the world. We've just done a new deal, for example, in Pakistan for Urdu language carriage. Each of those is an individually negotiated contract, as you'd expect. There's no template, there's no blanket contract, and they have different financial metrics around them. For the avoidance of doubt, we don't pay those carriage partners to get on the air. Other rival international broadcasters do that. We don't do that. We don't think that's an appropriate use of public money. But each of them has a different ebb and flow about the commercial revenue that attaches to those contracts. And then there is a small income, and it is small, of the commercial return on the World News Channel, where there are commercial breaks that are shown outside the UK. So it's not quite as simple as just licence fee and FCDO, though those two are easily the biggest of those shares.
Yeah. Okay.
One other point I'd make is we also have, we're a 100-year-old organisation that's had offices around the world, and I think we do need further investment in terms of our finance systems. This is not that I think we've got a big issue as such, but in terms of efficiency, and to your point about seeing things quickly and clearly, could we do better? Of course we could. I mean, one of the things we do with obviously we've got our annual review of the accounts with the NAO, very robust process, works well, like any it's verging on the normal to have just, us look in detail, look at where the exceptional items are. One of the things coming through that is we have too many people our record is good, by the way, so we're not sitting on anything that I'm saying we've we don't know what's going on in that area, or we've found things we're uncomfortable with. We've actually dealt with it, I think, really well. We've got good grip over the finances. That's different to complication or being able to see things quickly and make the right decisions well. There, I think we have got some opportunities. And I think there's not a company in the world, I'm sure, if you take, whether it be the civil service or anything, there's probably common issues here in terms of, a lot of our finances sit on, manual spreadsheets that then get inputted into the system. Yeah. We rely a lot on people locally putting stuff together, then putting it into the system. There's all that kind of work to be done. We're in the midst of that work. It's a classic, which is how much money do you want to spend in terms of your capital at that point versus day-to-day delivery to audiences, so someone gets good value for their license fee. We're not in a bad state. We're delivering our accounts and numbers.
Okay, well,
Sir John Whittingdale.
thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can I take a step back, Tim? You have repeatedly drawn attention to the fact that the BBC's overall income has suffered real terms decline over the last 5 years or more. And you set out the necessity of achieving substantial savings. How did you decide the proportion of those savings that the World Service should be required to meet?
It's an extremely good question, and I think there were the broad principles were the following, which is the first thing we had to do was ensure that from a overall BBC standpoint, we maintain usage and relevance in the UK. Because to the earlier question, if you don't make that licence fee income work, and the licence fee is, we may talk about it later, but we want to reform the licence fee. But the one thing the licence fee is dependent on is people's usage. And you know my views on this, which is, every week we get 80% of people using the BBC, and in a month, nearly everyone in the UK uses the BBC. We were very, very focused on what are the things that do two things: deliver that number, but also do it in a way that's in line with our purposes. Because you could just deliver it by making more and more entertainment shows. That's not what we want to do. We want to make sure and this is my job, one of the joys of my job is that balance between Gallic service versus the wonders and importance of that versus more traitors, all of that. So we went through a very detailed analysis of return on investment, where we ensured that the UK public were getting value. That was principle one. With regards to the World Service, we then said, okay, once we've done that, we also need to protect the World Service as well. And within that, we decided that it was a fair position that the World Service, you could make arguments if you took what I said purely, that the World Service, and we've talked about this, that could get even further cut, because you'd say for a house in Plymouth, these services are less, or in Penrith, these are less relevant to them than non-English services. But we felt strategically one of the most important things for the BBC, and this is the balances, was the World Service. So you don't deploy what I've just said so fully that you strip the World Service. Because you could take that argument. I think totally the wrong thing for the UK. So what we decided, directly to your question, is we wanted to protect the World Service investment broadly in cash terms. So you can see the analysis which shows inflation going there. So broadly keep it in cash terms in line with the rest of the BBC, and its cuts and pressures not particularly worse than the rest of the BBC. So not discriminate against the World Service, and do all we could to ensure we're making the right decisions to keep the audience numbers to a point while doing that. So it was, we couldn't justify, you know my view, I think, which is I think the UK should be spending double the amount it spends on this service without question. I mean, if you look what China and Russia are doing, 6 to 8 billion, I think it is absolutely paramount that we invest in what I think is a unique and precious UK strategic asset. I care about that enormously, and I think it needs investment. But in terms of the licence fee construct and how much you ask from household, I mean, I'm going around the country all the time. Household budgets are under enormous pressure. For us to ask for more for the World Service from the licence fee, I think is untenable. And for me to announce, I'm sorry, you won't be getting Radio 4 or all the other things we do, but we'll be paying money to the World Service, was not something we could do. So the short answer to your question keep the cash where it was, don't diminish the World Service, even though you could argue in terms of just pure return investment with regard to the UK licence fee payer, you might want to do that. I didn't want to do that. And don't cut the World Service more than the rest of news and all the other things, because we were facing a 30% over the last decade, 30% decline in real terms in terms of our income. That's what we've tried to do. Now, it isn't a perfect answer, because you can see that's what you wrestle with in my job, to try and get the right balance. I am proud of the team that we've maintained our reach at over 300 million with the successful efforts of the commercial arm. We're now over 400 million people getting BBC services every week. My personal view is I'd like to see 1 billion, but I cannot for the life of me see why we don't see this as a better investment as a nation. I really feel strongly about that. I can't go further with the licence fee.
So Tim, did at any point you lost 47 million audience in 2 years?
Yep.
Did you at any point sit down with the Foreign Office and say, is this the direction of travel that we should be going?
We've had, I mean, we have a good partnership with the World Service, but we've talked in detail with them, over a number of years, and they're under enormous pressure, as you know, in terms of public. This is a bit of a service where, I use the words rather cheap, pay and play. Like, if you invest more, you get more services, you can get more audience. It is worth noting that we are in a world where suddenly, from fixed distribution of radio and television, to state the obvious, we're now into so traditional media organisations are facing some structural decline anyway. And we are in the hands of algorithms where if Facebook decide not to do news, you're going to lose some audience. So we haven't seen it is a mixed picture as opposed to just general decline. There's different bits of pressure in different markets. But Jonathan, do you want to talk specifically about that? That I think it's quite a nuanced discussion about where you invest, because
can I follow up on that?
It's not just about audience, it's about strategic interest as well.
Well, precisely. I mean, following from the Chair's question, surely the value of 1 million listeners in the Western Balkans is considerably greater than 1 million listeners in a European Union country, for instance.
Totally agree.
So when you decided which services you were going to close, how much was that in discussion with the Foreign Office about the strategic priorities of the UK?
Fiona can run you through the criteria we use for that. Is that okay, Fiona?
Yes,
A very important question.
So when we are looking, and indeed when we looked at the first savings, we are always looking across the portfolio of what the World Service does, what it offers and the performance of that. So in terms of the offer for each market, are we on linear and are we on digital? What is the reach and the market share of that, and what is valued? What if people are coming directly to the BBC services or if they're getting it through a third party? We look at the market itself. So all markets around the world are turning towards digital, but at different rates. So what is the digital maturity of that market? Where are people going for their news and where do we need to be? And the readiness for that. And that is because we're always looking at that value for money. Where might we be able to make savings on linear if audiences are declining there, in order to ready ourselves for where they will be, which is digital. The other very important part of those three things that we're thinking about is audience need. So we look at indicators around fragility. We look at where there is conflict, where media is repressed, which is in 75%, are either low or totally restricted on media freedom. And a large percentage of our audience are in those markets, and that is a very important part of what we do. Also the demographics, where are we reaching women and where do we need to do more around young people? So these are the three kind of key criteria. We look across where we already are and where we need to retain our linear. In some places like Afghanistan, parts of French-speaking Africa, they need and we require to give them the radio and continue that. And so what you see in the first savings is more services becoming digital only. Where we saw the digital maturity of that market and we could do that, we moved to it. We also looked to move people, including for the value for money consideration we were under, we moved some of the services closer to the region. So we moved Bangla and Korean, for example. So that's how you see the picture building, the options of what we could do. And audiences of need is such a crucial part of what we do. We want to be there where audiences need us most. And in these 3 savings, of course, we've got the portfolio, the 43 languages that Tim spoke about. We've also started emergency services. So in Sudan, we started a weekly radio programme. In Gaza, we started a weekly radio programme. We started DAS in Afghanistan, which is an education programme for girls. It uses Bite Size, which is the UK product, but we make it in Pashto and Dari, and it was the only thing that girls in Afghanistan had for a year on television, radio and online. So these emergency, the agility for us to respond to events in the world is part of what the World Service needs to do.
But in your answer, you've repeatedly said you look at media freedom, you look at where there is strategic need. Surely these are issues which should be determined by the Foreign Office.
Well, they're absolutely that discussion with the Foreign Office. I mean, I've had it directly. These are where the areas of strategic need and the UK's interests, in terms of where we need to be investing, where there's democratic deficit.
So when you decide to close, not all 3 elements of the language service, but let's say the radio and TV, and maintain digital. Now, as I understand it, under the terms of the grant, you're not required to seek approval of the Foreign Office, but would you, in those circumstances, still go and say, we think we know?
Of course, we'd discuss it.
We have quarterly meetings with Foreign Office at officials level, and an annual meeting with the Foreign Secretary, and regular contact with the Minister of State who has responsibility for the World Service. And we have a no surprises policy in those meetings. I think that's important. It actually becomes more important if we're asking the Foreign Office for more money from the public funds, from taxpayer funds, to Mr. Lowe's point. And that dialogue is positive and constructive. And we would never, certainly not under my watch and not under Fiona's watch, we would never close any aspect of a service without the Foreign Office being aware that that was our proposal and being open to a discussion about the implications of that. But that doesn't mean we can avoid closures altogether. Of course, it means we calibrate with them the strategic priorities and all the criteria that we've discussed. Could I just make one clarification point about audiences, because it's come up twice in the conversation so far. And I think, Chair, you started with a figure that we'd lost audience since 2021-22, and you're right. But every global media organisation at that time had a bump in audiences because of COVID, because of lockdown, global lockdown. And if you look at the figures going back to pre-COVID, to 2016, 2017, so 9 years ago, the World Service was pulling in 210 million a week. We're now pulling in 313 million. So over the decade, it's gone up by nearly 50%. So I think it's important that the COVID years are not taken as a benchmark for, as it were, normal periods of activity, because that's not a reasonable benchmark.
I think the other benchmark I'd look to is how efficient we are at delivering our audience in a price per viewer and listener versus the competition being other state actors. And it is incredibly efficient. And I would look at those benchmarks, and we can give you that. They are really compelling. We can't get exact costs for the Chinese and Russian and Turkish operations at the moment, but we should be very proud on the services delivering those numbers. Just to finalise, so the answer to your question is absolutely. We're having those discussions with FCDO on the strategic interests and this team is not just simply get the audience number as high as possible.
And when
that's not. It's just not. It's absolutely got the strategic interests and what we need, where we need to be in play as well.
And when you finally get an outcome from the Foreign Office for next year's funding, and that's something which I think probably all of us sympathise that you have been unable to obtain it as yet. I pressed the Minister 2 days ago, and he still said that he wasn't in a position. But when that arrives, you would expect that not just to be a sum of money, but clear indicators of where the need is for it to be spent, potentially to increase services in parts of the world where the competition you referred to is strong.
Yes, I mean, in previous years we've had some conditionality around funding settlements. That's perfectly reasonable. They're largely around protecting existing services from complete closure, and as you know, it's a Foreign Office permission issue to close a language service in its entirety. They also hold the permission for launching new services, We've just launched BBC Polish because of the Eastern European point that you made earlier, Sir John, which is a success story in its short life so far. We're awaiting permission to launch 2 other Eastern language services for precisely that strategic reason. We'd like to accelerate that because it's the right thing for the audiences and it's also a more efficient business model, but most importantly because the Russian misinformation space is very important. On terms of other conditions, I think the relationship is very mature and very sensible and pragmatic with the Foreign Office, and we would expect conversations about those. And what we all agree about is actually a point that I think it was the MI6 chief who spoke recently about the sort of world order, which is the last few days have shown what a volatile place the outside world can be. But she spoke about the space between peace and war. That's where the world is in her assessment. It's in the space between peace and war. Well, in that space is where disinformation and misinformation thrives. So I hope that when we get to the Foreign Office settlement, any conditions that are attached allow us to really go for putting truth into that space in more parts of the world as efficiently as we can. I think that's what the Foreign Office wants as well. So we're pushing at the same.
It is a jointly agreed plan in that way. I mean, we recommend, we are in charge within the agreement we have. We can do things, but it's the public investment. It's us investing together, and regardless of almost all the ins and outs of it, we talk together about what we need to do with this to have maximum impact for the UK and for our audiences. And for the world. I mean, that is, and it is much more than just a return on investment on a numbers basis. That's why it's different to a commercial world. Because, some of these things, as we talked in Ukraine or Russia, you wouldn't, I was very blessed to sit with the president in Ukraine who said to me directly, thank goodness for these services, but we've had to relocate people out of Russia. We've had our Persian service at the moment reporting on these interesting events and important events in Iran. This is investment that I think is really critical. What I would say is, and we could not be more grateful for the 32 million, I think it was, increase in investment that we got. We are asking for a investment of a similar order in terms of uptick next year. It doesn't bring you a transformational change. I just want to, because if you look at where global inflation is, you look at competition, you look at the need to be on digital platforms on the same money versus operating just radio services. This is a real demand on our finances. So I think we can definitely look, we're doing what we can to get new digital services up and running or other services we need, but this is not transformational investment. It is sustained investment at best if we get a settlement. And just to ice the cake on the point about lead times, I am highly sympathetic to the pressures that the FCDO under. We have enormous, faith in their ability to support the World Service and work with us. Having said that, any business that has not got planning, we don't even know what our numbers are for April. Yeah? That is not, to the earlier point about planning and forecasting, that makes it difficult for the team. It's not impossible because you can manage the risks and you can manage the scenarios, but it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't mean you're going to overspend or anything like that. But what it does is it's the quality of decision making we were at earlier is affected by your lead time. That's just life.
So you've just said you're expecting a similar uptick in investment.
We've asked for it.
You've asked for it. Okay.
I didn't say
we're speculating here, but you must be doing planning now. If you get that level of investment from the SCDO, what will you do differently to what you're doing now?
Right.
Jonathan's mentioned some of the investment that we've put into Polska. Polska is different in several ways. It, for the first time, harnesses AI and is a translation tool. So what we're able to do is quite a slimline service where we can take the existing excellent BBC content from across the European region and beyond and translate it, always having a journalist signing that off. But it's a new way of working, and we believe we can do that for other markets, so hopefully for Hungarian and for Romanian, but beyond. The European security crisis is there. The disinformation is a particular worry in that region. So that would be a way that we could build on the countering disinformation that we do. We'd also want to put more money into the, not just countering disinformation by putting impartial news and information into those markets, but also the verification. So BBC Verify, I'm sure you know, we will further invest in that, as well as the disinformation team that we have in the World Service that looks at how these things happen, what are the trends underneath that are pushing disinformation and misinformation in. So that would be one particular area. I would also talk about circumvention. So at the moment, a fifth of our language services have some kind of hostile interference. It might be jamming of satellites for television, it might be blocking on websites, it might be taking down social accounts. We need to be able to, and throttling is the other thing that happens, which is a government slows down the internet speed so that you can't get onto, so all these different things are happening to a fifth of our services. We need to invest in circumvention to ensure that those people can get onto the BBC and can get trusted news from that. And that involves, it might be VPNs within apps. You know, there is technical things that we need to invest in in order to strengthen our circumvention. And I would turn again to audiences of greatest need, which is such an important part of the mission and the purpose of the World Service. We want to do more on education that I've mentioned, more on learning, thinking about the audiences that we're not reaching, particularly women and young people, thinking about how we organise ourselves to do that better. So those are some of the areas that we were particularly looking at, regions that are affected most by mis and disinformation, and where we see the Chinese CGTN, where we see the Russians, Russian Today and Sputnik come into the markets. They are starting to absorb some trust from those audiences and putting out a particular agenda for those news items. So I think we have to really think about that, and that would be where we would be proposing, along with the FCDO, looking at.
Thank you for that answer. There's bits in there that I think we need to come back to in relating to technology and satellites, but let's leave that for now.
Can I just mention it, sir, Chair, if I may? It is important, inflation.
Yes.
Because, you know, we've talked about, this is the Finance Committee, I mean, the level of investment we're talking about on a 300 million budget, you know, we are paying people around the world, we are running those services, paying contractors. We cannot avoid, however brutal we are in terms of our contract negotiation, and we're pretty flinty, we cannot avoid inflation. So if you are simply saying you're cash flat for the year, you're into cuts. So that is part of the presentation to the Foreign Office to say, together as the public, if we want to maintain the service as it is, I don't want to sugarcoat this, because there are some really great things we can do. But the level of ask at the moment, a lot of that is just simply keeping the show on the road as we sit today with an inflationary environment.
Point very well made. John, have you finished?
Just one final point, returning to the NAO analysis. I mean, one of their criticisms is that actually the rationale behind some of these decisions about individual services and where you cut back TV, radio services is not entirely clear, and there should be far more documentation and explanation as to how those decisions were reached.
We completely take that point. I think that's a very fair point of part of the NAO's analysis, and I think you've heard me say before, Sir John, that I think some of the specific decisions that were taken, particularly around Arabic radio, did not stand the test of time. I'm not suggesting that different paperwork and benchmark reporting would necessarily have changed the decision, but it would have given us a paper trail back to how that decision was formed in more detail, and I think that's a very fair point that the NAO have made.
Wish to examine that in greater detail later on. Matt Termaine, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I should declare an interest as well. Between 1998 and 2013, I did work for the BBC in BBC Worldwide. So just to get that out there, I'd like to talk a little bit about the implementation and monitoring of the World Service savings programme. So, Tim, Jonathan earlier on identified international inflation, the costs associated with moving the Russian outfit on the outbreak of the invasion of Ukraine, and the year-on-year single funding settlements as being reasons for why you haven't met those targets. But for each of the three of them, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about why you didn't meet the targets within the timeframes that were set for them.
Yeah, so I'll probably get the team to give me a little help as we go through it. It is about the time frame rather than the savings themselves. And I would say, you know, through the report, I think we're at 46.8. We're now getting we will deliver the 54 4.2, and this is a timing issue, not a delivery issue. That's important. I'm not dismissing the issues. I'm saying, Mr. Lowe giving me a look from earlier, that is absolutely right. There have been issues, and why don't we just take them in, because I think we can actually give you some detail around those three factors, which are obviously, and you can always come back to could we have forecast better, but certainly there have been some extreme times with regard to inflation. I think service stretch, I'll call it. Russia was one example of a number where we had extraordinary things we had to do to maintain our services. And the final point, which I think is slightly harder to quantify, which is this idea of planning cycle and not knowing what your budget is. So should we just do inflation first? Fiona, do you want to have a... Do you want to go, or Jonathan, do you want to...
Well, I can start, by all means. So taking
Correct.
the 3 years in sequence. And by the way, it is 3 one-year savings plans. It was never a 3-year, it's never one 3-year plan. It's 3 one-year plans. Because of the short-term funding issue we
Links
talked
to your
about
third
earlier.
point.
Yes.
So they happen to be sequential because the pressures of the issues I talked about earlier and the licence fee real value decline was a fact in all 3 of those years, but it was not one single plan. So the first year, where the target was 28.5 million, and I apologise in advance, there's a bit of data in this answer, but I think it's important to your question, Mr. Semaine. We met all those targets. There was a minor bit, there was an overspend the following year, but broadly speaking, that was a scheme that was fully implemented. In year 2, that was the year when the cost of things like the Riga relocation for the Russian service. We had then started the war in the Middle East. There were, to use Tim's phrase, service strains, and there were some ongoing costs around costs of change, which were carryovers from the previous year's change programme. We're all in there. We moved £1.2 million of the savings into the product group. That's not World Service, it's part of the central BBC group structure, which, for example, maintains things like the iPlayer, sounds, product development, and so on and so forth. So £2.8 million of the target was carried over into phase 3. Now, phase 3 is interesting because it's the one where we had the longest time lag. We met 8.4 million of the 11 million by December, and we'll meet the rest by next March. But I'm going to claim some responsibility here. I took the job as Global Director of BBC News in the September of that year, September 2024, having not previously been in the World Service. And in truth, I came into the job and I felt that we needed to make some structural changes to the way our services were managed. It's a different restructure from the one in 2022, which we can talk more about in a moment. But my feeling was that although an awful lot had happened in 2022, which I supported and I agreed with, and that was a restructure driven by savings imperatives principally, there was an unintended consequence, which was that some of the lines of accountability for editorial output were too opaque, to borrow a phrase that we used earlier in connection with the financial situation. When I asked who's in charge of this particular bit of the World Service should something go wrong, the answer was, well, it depends what goes wrong. And to me, that's not the answer. The answer is it's this human being. And that's not a blame game, it's just accountability. It's about... And I just felt that we needed to make some further changes. So I asked, which were cost-neutral changes, by the way. So I asked for a pause in some of the in-flight savings so that we weren't making savings in-flight in that year, which I was actually not, in truth, supportive of. I didn't find any of those. We carried through all those savings, but it was the wise thing to do, just to pause briefly, so that when I brought up a new regional structure based on senior leaders around the world rather than all being based in London, which I think is an important strategic move for the World Service, we were doing so knowing that the savings programme that we were coming to the end of in that last of the 3 years was still robust against that background.
Okay, thank you. So just for clarification, we're saying essentially the phase 1 stuff, it is done.
Right. Well, it will be done by the turn of this coming financial year.
Okay, so in this financial year, they'll all be done. That's good.
Yep.
Thank you. Those original 3 factors that we were talking about, the inflation, the service stretch, and the year-by-year settlements, they're generally external factors. Do you think there were any sort of internal factors that influenced the savings programme timeframe implementation? Or?
Yes, I can add to that. So the nature of Savings 1 and 2 are quite different. Savings 1 was about programme and platform closures, and so it entailed a significant staff reduction, up to 400 roles. And because of the complexity of the World Service, those 400 roles were in 33 different places. So we were complying an enormous amount of different frameworks, employment, legal. So we had to do that at a timeline that we weren't necessarily in charge of. So I think that gives a little bit of kind of context to that. The nature of the second savings was much more around distribution. So we renegotiated some contracts around shortwave and FM transmitters, for example. Some of them came to pass, some of them we could get a better deal on. And so that savings kind of changed the nature of it through the through the year. And actually, because we are always trying to mitigate audience loss, avoid audience loss, but provide value for money, we were able to change actually the nature of that, and it refers to it in the NAO report in how we captured that. But I think that is why, and it's why it is a slightly higher figure that moved from savings 2 to savings 3. On the plus side, and it was realised within the savings 3 financial year. So again, it was done shortly afterwards. But I think that helps also to explain our audience loss on savings 2 and 3 were far less than we had predicted. We had predicted we would lose 11 million in savings 2 and 3.8 in savings 3, and actually we avoided most of those losses because we were able to change and find other ways to save money.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Sorry, just scribbling notes. So I wonder also if you could tell me a little bit about the project management methodology that was used for some of this. I mean, the report does reference, perhaps where it could have been slightly better than it was. So if you could tell me a little bit about that, that would be quite helpful in terms of, what methodologies are used, how they're implemented, and how they're, monitored from a senior management perspective.
Yes, and as you say, it's an area of concern within the report. I think one of the elements to this is the pace in which it happened. So at the time, a new director of the World Service came in at the end of 21. The savings were identified around there, the amount that had to be found, and some of the planning that we talked about earlier on in the committee around the market analysis and the offer analysis, and trying to see where we would best take those savings in order to protect audiences, started to happen within the BBC and with the FCDO. So at that point, there was a optionality, an options look at what we might be able to do, and a savings case made. That was obviously pushed through the sign-off system, and I think there's, what figure is it? I think it's figure 9, which shows the governance board. So at that point, the news board is the highest level of sign-off. Underneath that, you've got the steering group, which is led by the project sponsor, which was the director at the time. Under that, there was the programme board, which in the job that I was doing then, I was sitting on, which was the kind of what we were doing in Africa in terms of the savings, and the kind of work streams flowed from that. As it says in the NAO report, we did a RAID analysis on that and continued to do it throughout savings 1. That was the other thing to say, and I think this is an area that we have changed from the report, is we didn't have at that point any dedicated project management support within the World Service. And the director at the time knew we needed it, and it took several months to get that person in and get started. And so there is, I think, a fair criticism within the report that lag did not help in terms of the inputs, outputs and outcome tracking. We've changed that now. We now have a new role, which is a strategic planning and delivery senior role, so that as we have more changes that will inevitably come, we have that baked in and there won't be that delay.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. I think there is another question later on about future projections, so I won't touch on that there. And any other internal factors in terms of those targets, or you think you're relatively comfortable doing it going forwards?
Yes, I think we've identified most of those. Yes.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Rupert Lowe.
Right, well, I think we've touched on this earlier on. I mean, my concern here, I mean, this committee sits with a hat of basically representing the taxpayers and value for money. That's the reason we're here. And, I mean, as the NAO says, without clear ways of measuring non-financial impacts, I mean, how can you demonstrate the savings you're making? And I accept you're making savings, Tim, but are they having a detrimental effect? And what you've talked a lot about how much you need money. And I watch Elon Musk cut the overhead at X by 80%, and arguably it's a more efficient platform. I watch my own social media output, which absolutely astounds me, that so much has changed so quickly, as you say. I watch the British economy declining, and I hear you saying we need all this soft power, which can't have been helped by this Trump issue, as I'll refer to it as, which again we don't want to go into too much detail on. So I'm without the tools of actually judging what's going on here, I'm concerned that what we're seeing is a changing demographic. Young people don't trust the BBC, in my opinion. That's quite clear. They get their news and their media and their information from all sorts of platforms. Question, is the World Services audience aging? You talk about the issue of switching to digital. Are they interested in digital services, which the young clearly are? Have you got an issue with an aging audience who are effectively, whatever you do, your audience in the World Service is going to decline? I mean, these are questions, I think, with a taxpayer hat on, I'd like to know that you've thought about, because I don't think it's just a question of chucking money at it. Whenever I sit around this table, all state entities, all they ever want to do is hurl cash at the situation, hire more people. Not the digital age means you don't need to hire more people. You don't necessarily need more cash. What you need is more intellect. And the question is, are you actually able to judge? Are you able to judge that you are delivering using the digital revolution, which has changed everything?
Totally agree. And are we discussing it daily, if not most hours of the day?
But you can't judge it if you haven't got the information.
Bear with me. And I think you've touched on a number of subjects there that are important, which is, firstly, one of trust, which we could get to in other elements of discussion, but that is critical, of course. Critical, and holding trust and ensuring we deliver on that is sacrosanct to the BBC, and when we make mistakes that costs us, but we work very hard to deliver against our editorial guidelines. That is important. And I would be very cautious about saying people, even groups don't trust us. That's not where the evidence is at the moment. It says it's under pressure around traditional media operations, but actually globally, among all age groups, trust levels are high, and we should protect that. I don't
think you'll find, Tim, the young don't go to the BBC.
We found in our last report, Tim, that only 51% of the young get their information from the BBC. That is a shocking statistic.
Absolutely, but 51% is something that we should be, at least we are in a position where the majority of 16 to 34s come to the BBC every week. We're still fighting that battle. Do we think we've got massive challenges like every traditional media? Of course we have. Of course we have. But the idea then you say that we do not work extremely hard, and I'll come to the team in a minute, about how do we go to where young audiences are on different. I mean, I have quite a lot of pressure to remove the BBC from X, by the way. That is not what I'll be doing, because we need to be on these platforms. We need to give quality information onto these social media platforms, bring people into it, and I actually think that's critical, because otherwise the Chinese, the Iranians, they're flooding the zone. And they're investing very hard. Separately, and it's just there's a lot in what you said, because the other thing is the efficiency of, I don't think there's any naivety in the BBC around you just chuck more people at a problem, and that's how you solve it. And but hold on, push back at me on the facts, because during this period we have taken 1,800 people out of the BBC public service. 1,800, okay? I think was the latest number. We've taken the number down. There's a lot of people. These guys have done a savings plan where we've lost 400 people from the World Service and largely kept the audience flat on a long-term decade basis. Okay, no one is more committed to. We've ripped out 700 million of cost so that we can protect our programming budgets and our service budgets while taking hundreds of millions out of our back office. I would welcome you to wander around the World Service. And also, I've been very aggressive in terms of getting external benchmarking of our benchmark costs. Now, then we get to technology. Now, it's a bit of yes, but. Yes, when we look at AI and what it can deliver to production processes, media supply chain, we're leading edge on this. If you go around the world and talk to other broadcasters, they want to know what the BBC are doing to reduce cost in the area you're talking about. But you cannot escape that if you want to have quality editorial, quality journalism, you will need investment. And I do not think it is incompatible to say we are rigorous and aggressive on the savings front. And give me the data, because we are benchmarking, we're doing external benchmarking going to the licence fee settlement in terms of, I couldn't agree with you more, in terms of ruthless looking at our resources and going to the bone in terms of people. But you cannot escape. Our service is different to X. X is a model that is contributed by the public and others to the market square where everyone shouts at each other is one model. Okay, and I'm not disputing it. What we do is something different. We do quality journalism with people on the ground. The Persian service, I've got 300 people living in exile in the World Service because what they need to do, they're trying to do, is do free and fair reporting. That is not something that can be replaced by technology. Now we have to decide that, and we have to build trust in everyone that we are an efficient operation. But honestly, any benchmarks, any assessment of the BBC, I think we should be proud of what we're doing in terms of our cost benchmark.
Well, I haven't got much more time because I can feel the chairman itching on my left here. But I think there's a different issue between editorial product and distribution. You've got to split the two.
Totally agree.
And I think I can safely say that since the Long Parliament, the British have been very, very suspicious of monopolies. And you will be the first monopoly in history to actually dismantle yourself willingly and actually deliver value for money. So I find it very difficult. I'm very concerned that the taxpayer, as usual, is on the wrong end of this deal. And when I read this report, I'm concerned. So I think there's a lot that you do need to take account of going forward. And I'm on that note, I'm going to stop.
Could I just respond to that before? Thank you so much. I agree with an awful lot in your question, but not quite all of it. For a start, in no way are we saying that we're going to throw more and more people to solve our problems. The Polish service, which Fiona described earlier, is run on 4 people, just 4 people. And that's a model of efficiency which we are pioneering in the World Service. The World Service costs about 87 pence per year for each user of the World Service, and those users are measured per week. Now, we don't know how much the Russians and Chinese cost per user because they're not transparent about their figures, but I can guarantee you it is multiple times more than that per user, multiple times. The only model that was really comparable with us has just been defunded, the US AGM structure. They were more than double the cost per user of the World Service. And on your point about metrics of success other than finance, I think it is an important point. We do a lot of research, independently commissioned, it's not done by the BBC, about the BBC's influence around the world. And year after year after year, it shows a consistent thing, which is the UK has a lot of important exports around the world, which are important for the brand value of UK PLC. The Premier League is one of them, the Royal Family is another. The BBC is off the scale in terms of influence and importance to the UK, and that affects the impression of the UK, it affects trade, it affects relations, it affects even opinion formers sending their children to school here. It says something about the values of the UK. They're really important benchmarks and metrics, and we track them very, very closely.
We have to be a growth investment, to your point. If we're just a lump of public cost, I don't think we're looking at this the right way. We have to see it as a incredibly efficient growth investment for UK PLC. Now, the data suggests that those people who connect with the BBC, who connect with the World Service, I mean, if I want cheering up in my job, because there are days, I just go anywhere in the world and talk to them about the BBC, pretty much. And we have an incredible asset that delivers investment into the UK. Now that, if we don't believe that case, and we're not making that case, and clearly we've got to improve. You can see this report, so there's things we can do in our documentation, but broadly speaking, the overall metrics on return on investment are extremely strong for the World Service. I'm very, very proud of the team. Walk round the 5th floor in Broadcasting House and go and see those teams. Hundreds of people have left and they maintain the numbers.
I'm sure
Now-
we can have a further
now-
debate on this, but I'm not sure UK PLC is in particularly good health. And we look at the economy
that
here
is a
being
topic I'm
destroyed.
probably not going to go into
So let's
in
have a
this
debate
committee
about that at a
meeting.
different time. So are you spreading the word on something that's failing within? So I mean that's a
We're not,
question.
we're not spreading the word in terms of advocating for the UK government. That's not our job.
We're not Victorian Britain.
Exactly.
Okay.
But we are we fly a flag in a different way on behalf of the UK, and we're very happy to do that.
But that's a decision for all of us, Mr. Lowe. That is a decision for all of us on whether we think this investment for the World Service, separate to the UK creative economy and our global position in that with the licence fee and all that brings, this is a decision for all of us in terms of do we want to invest in something that my view, and I'm just giving you a view as someone who's been in the job for a while and looks at this situation, looks at our overall competitiveness, and we're not, to Jonathan's point, very important, the flag we're waving is for democratic and principle and truth and reporting. All right, we're not perfect. We know that. We can have that discussion. But overall, if you look at the numbers, we are number one on those metrics statistically around the world. Now, my view is that is a sensible investment, and it's a very powerful investment to make to UK households. They want to see these success stories for the UK thrive. And it is absolutely right we do that highly cost efficiently. We look at technology, we're healthily paranoid about ageing audiences, all those things. But it's easy to pick holes. The issue is, do we think this is a cost-effective weapon to grow the UK in terms of all that means? I'm not
I don't think we're picking holes, Tim. I think what we're saying is let's get at the truth. That's where we want to be.
I think we're in exactly the same position on
I
that.
end there, Chairman.
Thank
Very
you.
good place for you to end. One short question from me, or maybe more, depending on the answers, and then we're going to take a break. So the question from me is that you made a very important point, Jonathan, that this is 3 individual programmes. It wasn't a 3-year programme. So the first year you made your savings, I'm looking at table 7, figure 7, of 28.5, but you did it by cutting a lot of the television and radio services around the world, and you lost 47 million audience in the process. The second year, you have not yet made it. It was supposed to be 17.4, but it was 30. You actually saved 13.3, and you were about to lose another 5 million audience. On phase 3, that's this year's, you are well short. You were supposed to make 11.1 and you've made 5. So my question to you is, and it's back to the question I asked you earlier, what did you do at the end of each of those 3 years to evaluate before you went on to the next year? For example, if I take you to paragraph 2.9 on page 28, it says, in October 24, the service concluded that the structures had not met the needs that were designed to address and presented challenges that undermined the effective delivery of strategic objectives. This tells me that this was a process that you weren't learning from as you went along.
I think there were some valid points in the critique in 2.8 about the year-by-year nature of the learnings, and I think that's a very point well made by the colleagues at the NAO, and we welcome it. Each year we always, as part of the process not only of closing the budget but also setting targets for savings the following year, we always look back at the state of play as at that moment, and as you rightly point out, year 1 was pretty okay, and I think it was pretty much bang on. Year 2 there was some slippage, year 3 there was more slippage. So for example, at the end of year 2, we, as I mentioned this earlier, but just for clarity, we found savings elsewhere in the BBC to offset some of the savings that we weren't able to make in the World Service at that time. For the reasons we've been through before, I suggest I don't go through them again because they're quite repetitive. In year 3, that was slightly different because we did, as I mentioned earlier in response to the question from Mr. Tamain, make a strategic choice there to pause some of the savings in order to restructure properly for the future. So each of the learnings from each year is different. They're not the same learnings. Year 1 was the year when platform services were closed, not whole services as we were discussing earlier, but for example the delivery of audio services in Arabic and some other broadcast services in Africa, for example. some of the services that we then invested in as part of the rearrangement of savings had only been started relatively recently in a programme sponsored by the Foreign Office called World 2020, where they asked us to expand our footprint of language services, and that led to an increase in the grant in aid funds. So all of that was quite a complicated picture, and of course year one was also the aftermath of COVID, so it was quite a complicated, difficult equation. But I think in the NAO's point in 2.8 about the paperwork and the learnings, where we sort of put down a marker and say, how did we do in this particular year, and what does that do in terms of the effect on the next following year's plan, separate plan. I think the NAO is right that we've got some learnings to take away and to refine our processes to make sure that when we look back on them, for example, now, looking back on those 3 years, there is a clearer assessment of what did and didn't work. I think if we dig down deep into existing data, for example, on audience loss and on reach on digital, which has quadrupled in the 10-year period up to today, we can see that there's a good story to tell, but I fully accept that looking at the accountancy process and things associated with it at that time, we have got improvements to make.
As well as hopefully getting this extra money, that you can do some changes, do you have a continuing savings programme? You're looking at everything you do to make sure that actually you're doing it in a cost-effective way as you could.
Continuing savings programme across the BBC, so and including the whole of BBC News, and that will affect the World Service. How much it affects the World Service will depend on the Foreign Office settlement, because one of the things we've said to the Foreign Office is that, and we've said this over a number of years, this isn't a new message, and as you know there have been a number of different Foreign Secretaries in recent years and ministers. We've said that we believe that the freeze and the licence fee under the previous government for effectively 2.5 years, because the third year was below inflation, licence fee rise. The unintended consequence of that was to cut the available funds for the World Service. I don't believe that anybody sat there and thought, we'll freeze the licence fee and we'll damage the World Service deliberately. I honestly don't believe anyone thought that. I think it was unintended consequence. In order to plug that gap, we needed an increase in what was known at the time as grant in aid. I just call it, to Rupert Lowe's point, taxpayers' money. It's central government money. But some of that money can mitigate the need for cuts in the World Service against the backdrop of further spending restrictions in the BBC as a whole. Until we know what that settlement is, it's really hard, in fact it's, I'd say impossible, to accurately give you an assessment of what we will need that money to do for us.
I just say, I mean, this will be probably further discussions of this committee over time, but there is no scenario in which the BBC isn't having to make aggressive efficiency savings in the forthcoming period, regardless of the charter settlement. You know, and how we go into the intricacies of funding the BBC, and the reason is because if you look at where the market is, you've got two things going on. You've got rapid inflation in terms of production cost, in terms of supply. So that needs, I mean, we're fighting with competitors with £17 billion content budget. So if you care about UK creativity, if you're in my job, you're trying to get as much money onto the front line, not building up bureaucracy. That's just disaster. All right, and the BBC, I think, is actually, you know, for all its, you know, slings and arrows of fortune, it's like it has actually got this clear mission, which is because it has direct accountability to offer value to households, we absolutely have to do that. So we will be aggressive in terms of deploying AI, thinking about how we rewire our production. This is going to be an age of enormous change. And that is important because what I don't want to see is public service broadcasting wither in traditional formats of sitting on linear services. And to Mr. Lowe's point, the next generation goes, well, that's not for me. We need to be on YouTube. We need to be in this if we care about this. Now, redoing that within the constraints of a budget that is not heavily leveraged in the way we've seen with the major entities around the, you know, the big entities, they've got billions of leverage. Yeah, it's a completely different model. So I think we've done a remarkable job, and I would say that, over the last 5 years of staying at the races digitally. Look at us, we're the only, among 1634s, we're the only UK source that in the top 10 in terms of being trusted. You know, we're still at the races. I've got the issues with the numbers, but we're in the game. Now, the iPlayer is still a very competitive product. That is because we've moved enormous amounts. 80%, I think, of the savings in the BBC that you hear about are actually because we've chosen as a management to move money around, not just because we've been forced by our overall funding settlement. They're because we as the leaders are going, we've got to move money in the organisation to become a digital entity. That will not stop. and I think it's going to be very tough. I'm sure it's the same with any public institution, that if we are going to truly transform ourselves and not get left behind, we are going to have to deliver enormous efficiencies to do that. It's not going to be easy. And that's, the jeopardy is high here. And I think that does not detract from the need for investment. You see, this is where I think it's an and. Unfortunately, it's an and, not an or, based on where the world is going. That's inevitable.
So, thank you for that very interesting answer, well, all of your answers this morning. We're going to take a short break now. The clock is 11:18. Should we try and be back here fairly promptly by 11:25? And to start us with, when we come back, will be Sarah Heath, please. And thank you very much for this morning's evidence. And we look forward to more interesting revelations in part 2. Thank you very much indeed. committee's hearing, and we now start, please, with Sarah Heath on her question. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Just returning back to what we were discussing before we broke, in terms of the management of the savings programme, the NAO report does refer to the lessons learned exercise that the service did itself, but how there isn't a well-developed process for implementing those lessons learned. So I'm keen to understand what assurances you can give the committee that the changes you're now implementing will have will lead to the improvements that you hope they will.
Shall I talk a little bit about how we did the lessons learned process from Savings One? So Savings One, as I think we've talked about, was editorial based. It was scope based. So there was closures of programmes and platforms in order to make the savings. As part of this, there was a change in the operating model. So previously we had been in a regional model, then we went to an output and a content model that reflected the BBC's English newsroom. That is in essence how they are organised into news content, into news programmes. So there was a decision to do that to enable us to meet the objectives that we had been that had been set out in Savings One. Now that operating model took some time to settle down because it's a significant change. Because we were tilting towards digital, there was a lot of upskilling to do. So there was a lot of training programs. There was a lot of best practice sharing across services. Some new accounts opening in digital. So it's quite a big and significant change. So the lessons learnt process was primarily an editorial level. So it looked at the editorial decision-making points, it looked at the amount of content, the balance and mix of the content in the different outputs, where those decisions were made and how they were communicated, even so far as the timings of the meetings. You know, there was quite a detailed kind of process in that. And there was a large amount of staff who were involved in that, workshops and various things around that. The outcomes of those were implemented into the workings of the newsrooms around the world, and they had some success in improving the kind of communications and decision making in the new model. So I think in that part, the lessons learnt was done well and fairly robust. I think where the NAO report comes in is the more around the governance, more around the documentation, more around some of the things we've already talked about, the financial kind of inputs, outputs and outcomes and I think in that point we have made the point that we don't think that was clear enough and we need to do differently in the future. And we've put some measures in place which I can talk about if helpful.
Yeah, that I think it would be helpful. So that's really helpful for you to have shared about the editorial side of it. That's really helpful. If I refer to the report, which you might have a copy of, in section 2.22, I think you do list, the NAO do list some of the changes that you're implementing around tracking finances and recommendations following whistleblowing. I think it would be helpful for the committee to better understand some of those changes.
Yes. So in terms of tracking finances, so some of the changes that we've made is that we've introduced a new monthly tracking system, and that brings together more of the financial data, including savings and EFT, the posts across the business, into a single place, which is a regular meeting with all the people in the room to ensure that we've got full transparency, and that goes up to stakeholders and people who need to see that. So that monthly tracking system is new.
It's in place.
Yes,
yeah.
We've already started that. Jonathan and Tim referred to this earlier on around the accountancy kind of software, and at the moment, obviously, you know, the World Service operates in 50 different countries. So what the accountancy systems that we're doing, and we're in the process of doing this at the moment, is about consistency to make sure that they are all feeding. They can feed the monthly tracking system, and that can have a lot more resilience to where it was. One of the difficulties, I think, of the previous savings is that some of the savings, most of the savings happened within the World Service, but there are dependencies, and so other parts of the BBC were making savings in order to support their own savings targets and ours, and those things were not communicating as they should. So those are the things that have been put in place. Also, I should mention a new role that is on News Board now, which is the Transformation Director. And that is someone who is looking across our constant process of change. And that has, I think, really helped because it can take a wider view. It's not just World Service, it's not just other parts of news, it's overall. So I think those are some of the things that we have done to improve that. In terms of the whistleblowing, I think whistleblowing is a very important process that we have in the BBC, and we are always grateful when people kind of come forward and talk about that. Those recommendations that came from the whistleblowing are in some ways reflected in the NAO, both what they found and what was found in the whistleblowing. So there's a lot of overlap, and the things that we have done answers both the whistleblowing and the NAO recommendations. And changes from the new structure. Some of these are around how we organise our decision making and how we document it and implement it and review it. And so we have a new process that we have started 9 months ago, which is a quarterly performance review. And that is a much wider ranging meeting now, but it stems from a kind of a work stream, and that looks at the non-financial outcomes. So it looks very clearly at the inputs, financial and otherwise, the outputs, including the content volume and the mix that I've previously talked about, and the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve around our audiences in terms of reach, in terms of trust, in terms of value. So that process, which involves all the new regional directors within the structure, is a really robust and really helpful thing that we've done.
Is there anything not on this list that's currently being implemented? Because this would have been written and researched a short while ago. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that list?
Yes, I think one of the learnings from me and from reading and absorbing this and acting on it is about our metric systems. So I think we have a very strong audience team in the BBC, and they have an enormous amount of expertise and metrics from digital and from our global audience measure, which I'm sure you've seen in the report. We have recently done a big change on our dashboards, which means that every journalist who comes in their morning, kind of read in, is looking to see how their site is performing, how the socials are performing. And because it's live feedback, it is live metrics, it is such a useful tool. And a lot of journalists across the World Service are metrics driven. They really want their stories to do well. They really want to learn what their audiences want. And I think, to perhaps Mr. Lowe's point, there is also demographic data. We know which young people are reading that, what's the proportion of women who are looking at that. And so I would say, alongside this, we've also done a lot of work around our metrics database, which helps inform our decision even at a greater level.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Yes. Are you happy? Do you want to go on to your question on audiences, or do you think I've cut across you and covered
You
it?
can cut across me.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm very sorry about that. Damien Hines. Even.
Me?
If Damien Hines even.
New chairman.
New name.
It's not the first time, or even nearly the first time that's happened. I want to come back to metrics and KPIs in a moment, if I may. But first, can I ask about the digital first approach? So we say there is a digital first approach, but many things can be digital, from a DAB radio station to a video on demand platform, to somebody else's video on demand platform, to Facebook, YouTube, news aggregators. I mean, most perhaps these days the media landscape is digital. So what do you mean by digital first, and why in the NAO report does it have to report back that some of the teams involved were not clear on what good looks like in the digital first approach?
Should I just do the strategic? Let's do this as a strategic point. It's an extremely well-made point, because we're not using digital first meant move to online.
Right.
Yeah, and and that debate's been had in the BBC, and I think everything's digital. Yeah. So we're looking back on a programme that worked, by the way. It worked because, and the reason we said digital first, because organisations can be slow to change. Successful organisations can be particularly slow to change because they defend their position, and the BBC does pretty well. So we needed to agitate to make sure that iPlayer, sports apps, all those things, hiring engineers, putting money, hundreds of millions of pounds were taken out of other areas to make sure we were competitive digitally. What that really means is the whole organisation has gone digital, but what we're talking about is online services. And when I say online services, I mean fully owned and operated online services, and third-party services, of course, in YouTube and
All, in other words.
So yeah, it's online content. That's what it means. All right.
So for clarity, in your question, you mentioned digital DAB radio stations. For us, that would be radio. We class that as radio.
That's not digital.
Yes.
So, and in world service terms, this is the year when digital has become the biggest delivery, just overtaken radio. Only just overtaken radio. Radio is remarkably resilient. It's a remarkably resilient platform. And television is the third of the three, although they're quite close, in fact. But digital now accounts for about 130, just over 130 million of our global audience measure, which is the biggest single delivery of the three.
So when the NAO report says that some teams, this is in paragraph 2.15, that some teams were not clear what good looks like in that strategy, what does it look like?
It's measured on a number of metrics. I mean, global audience measure, or the reach, is probably the most important in data points. But there's a breakdown of that within the figure about the demographic of people we are reaching. And in particular, to a point that was raised earlier, younger audiences are far more likely to come to us on a digital platform than on a linear platform in most parts of the world. So I was in Lagos pretty recently, where we operate a number of language services, all but one of them are digital only. So what good looks like there is a matter of reach and the demographic of that reach. Now that in itself is quite a complicated breakdown, because you've got Instagram, you've got TikTok, you've got YouTube, you've got other platforms, and social media posts in their simplest forms too, and they're all measured. And of course digital audiences can be measured in real time, whereas linear audiences, there's usually a backlog in the way that we measure them. If there's confusion, I suspect it's in those services where we have multiple platforms. We have digital and linear still going on. And there are quite a few of those still, despite changes that we have made. And that's largely because television and radio are resilient forms of delivery to certain markets. In some markets, we're going back into linear in a way that we have withdrawn from. So, for example, we've just relaunched an Urdu language television bulletin for Pakistan. But digital is still by far and away the biggest reach there. It's nearly doubled in the last 4 years in Pakistan, for example.
But you've just done it again. Digital is the biggest. What does that mean? Do you mean being on YouTube, being on Facebook? Do you mean your own owned digital channels?
All of the above.
Okay.
All of the above.
So that's not one thing.
So to unpack that then, the most important reach for us is reach where people can see and feel that they're with the BBC. We used to call that valued reach, where they're looking at a product and they know it's the BBC. But the real purpose of World Service News is to put truth into markets where truth is in scarce supply. If that truth is carried on a third-party platform, but it still reaches the audience, that's still very effective reach. It's just not attributed reach in quite the same way. So we measure them all and accumulate them all, and the digital figure is all of those platforms, whether they're owned and operated by the BBC or whether they're carried on third-party platforms.
So this is fairly standard stuff to a degree, but let me explain what I think there is. This goes across the BBC, by the way. So the first one is fair point, and this is the semantics of this can be unhelpful at times. We're talking about online in that regard. So DAB is traditional broadcasting, but everything's digital. So we now internally talk a bit more about online and making sure that a digital first organisation means you've got a strong online presence. Now, what are the metrics? Clearly they're about reach, audience reach and demographics. That is overarching to make sure that we have a very simple objective, which is we know people who are exposed to the World Service and the BBC are 43% more likely to invest in Britain. We believe it's a good thing. We've got lots of data that says that is a good thing. Now, that is reach. Now, within that, however, and I do think this is a challenge for editorial teams who are traditionally producing half-an-hour programmes, what does good look like online? Is it that you've had a small piece of YouTube content and And what we need to do is, involving our metrics, we need a classic brand pyramid, forgive the jargon, which is how many people in total goes to BBC, including third party. That's an incredibly important metric for us. But it's also important that we look at how many people use BBC services. Because in terms of attributing value, particularly in the UK, when I say 80% of people use the BBC and 94% in a month, or that is BBC services. But in terms of maintaining universality, I think you're going to have to also look at third-party reach. Classic stuff, it's classic stuff. What we're now doing is developing metrics where we look at what's total reach, what's reach on our services. And I think what you're hearing in the report is a number of our editorial teams, it's totally natural. If you were producing The Traitors or you were producing a World Service News Hour programme, what does success look like on online platforms? Is it putting the whole... it is iterative, that experience as well, because you're learning. Maybe that doesn't work. Look at news on iPlayer. We want everyone, a large portion of the audience to be getting quality news on iPlayer. But just putting the 6 o'clock on it is not going to work. So I think there's an element of that in here, which is how do you make it work?
To be clear, on the non-attributed content, you have an immensely valuable...
Less attributed.
Well, some is some maybe... It depends what the user sees, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean...
We can secure an element of branding in it. Yeah.
Well, so there's a sliding scale. You have an amazingly valuable asset which only maintains its value by being used.
Exactly.
And there is, I would suggest, for the kind of long-term benefit to UK PLC and indeed to the world, you have to maintain that brand equity. The swings you were talking about in audience reach, I mean, are enormous over a 10-year period. I mean, some might say suspiciously large. Do you count as somebody who stumbles across something on a social media feed once a week from the BBC, does that count as audience reach in the same way as someone who is a regular listener to a World Service radio station or a World Service TV station?
So it's done by a method called the Global Audience Measure. And the Global Audience Measure is an annual, and it's an internationally recognised measure that all major global broadcasters use. Some, like our colleagues in China and Russia, do less transparency around their figures, but we know that to be true. That does count interactions with the BBC on a weekly, but you have to interact with the BBC at least once a week.
So is the simple answer to my question yes?
So specifically on viewing a social media post, Fiona, I don't know whether you're...
Yes, it's a duration, so you don't. If you just scroll past it, you don't count.
No, so you have
if
to
you
have
watch
dwell
it for
time,
10 seconds,
but you have 10-second dwell
10
time.
seconds, you must engage with
so
it.
that counts as having engaged the BBC once a week. And so another individual who was a regular listener to World Service News would count. That's a one-on-one.
As long as they come once a week.
As long as they come once a week.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's just a view. So if they're just looking at it on a mobile phone, that's just a view. It doesn't count to GAM. GAM is a weekly audience figure. So it takes all. So there's a big chart on it. It is a complicated process, but in essence, it takes a variety of different measures. And on digital, there is a duration in order to do it, which counts as a view, and then that is extrapolated from that.
Okay, I'm not sure I quite followed that answer in its full majesty. I'm trying to understand what. So there's been this huge increase in audience, and you would expect that with the growth of social media and YouTube and all the rest of it, obviously people are going to be exposed to a much wider range. Not obviously, but can be exposed to a much wider range of media. Is that the reason why your audience reach figure has gone up so dramatically over 10 years? I mean, I think the answer is yes, but just it would be helpful perhaps just to get it on the record.
Yes, but it's a bit more complicated than that. As I mentioned a little earlier, we had quite a big expansion programme funded by the Foreign Office into new languages, which have done quite a lot to raise
traditional distribution as well,
in both traditional and digital. So that's the first point. We have expanded, for example, in Africa, we've added 7 or 8 new languages in that period, and that takes us to key audiences of need, for example, in Somalia or northern Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So that is part of the picture. Part of the picture is also that we are, like all media organisations, clearly available multi-platform. So we have a much more advanced Instagram and YouTube strategy now than we did before this period started for obvious reasons. The platforms have become more mature and the competition's become more acute, and therefore we are more present on them. But we have also invested in linear products where those linear products are still growing. Television is still growing in Africa, for example. So it's not the case that the whole world is moving at the same pace on digital. Clearly, the digital penetration in some parts of the world is much more mature. So if you take, for example, Latin America, and we know that Venezuela is top of the world's news agenda right now. BBC Munro is one of the oldest language services, used to have radio and television. It is now purely a digital service. But its reach is really impressive against that background, particularly in Mexico and the northern part of South America. And I haven't seen the latest figures for Venezuela, but I can promise you they'll be enormous, because people at times of crisis do come to the BBC as an external teller of the story of their part of the world. Well, that's a story where we took a language service and we de-invested in linear, and we said, look, linear is not where that market is. We want to pile on digital in that market. That market itself, however, is changing because of the loss of USAGM. They were huge in Latin America.
I just want to, your question, the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you.
And the reason I'm saying that, it's a very, very good question, if I may, and let's just
You may.
have a moment of let's have a moment of agreement, Mr. Hans, which is there is almost a minimum amount of time and connection you want with someone so they ascribe value. We get to another thing, which is ascribing value to a service so they'll pay for it. Yeah. But I would say the good news for us is most organisers, I think most are monthly, we're at weekly, so we've set the bar a bit higher. We also haven't done if you just swipe one piece of BBC content. So there is a degree of depth in what we're recording. Okay? And we think that, sorry, I just want that we believe that to be meaningful. It's only about 10 seconds, but we know also that people are doing that are likely to repeat that. The other thing is value attribution is not just about time. This is about the BBC more generally. It's a real tension for all of us, because we've grown up in an age where you'd be on intravenous strip on the radio station or whatever. Actually, if you, in a country, go to the BBC headlines, you might not spend that long. You might read a couple of articles and be out, but the value to you is extreme. Yeah. So that's what we're tracking.
I don't want to cut you short, but I am conscious that we are short of time. So reach is one measure. I mean, people might say the better measure is share. Yep. And specifically share, not just overall in the world, but then you would say, what about young people? In a lot of these countries we're talking about, actually young people are the majority of people in the country. Yep. And you would say, what about countries which are unstable or where there's a lot of contestability from competitor broadcasting services? Do we measure share?
We do where it's possible, but it's not always possible. We do measure the demographic of people who come to us, particularly around the ratio of female consumers, and that is actually a Foreign Office agreed target. So we have a target that 34% of our audience should be female globally, outside the UK. We are just about at that target. We'd like to be more successful in that, and we're launching various products to try to address that, particularly in Africa. We know about the age profile of digital consumers on platforms where there's sign-in. That's an easy piece of data to acquire. Share requires knowledge of what, for example, the Chinese and Russians are able to do. Now, in some markets we can measure that, but we can't measure it in all markets, and unlike us, they're not transparent about it. So if we go and do a sample test in a market, we can judge it, but we can't necessarily extrapolate that around the world.
I think it's a really... I'm not sure share is the best measure. Commercially, I used to be obsessed with share, by the way.
Yeah, you were an advertiser.
Everything. No, but bear with me. That's everything. Everything. And this is why I would shiver when I hear the idea that there's any monopoly going. It's not about... What I think is most important for the BBC is that we have a meaningful relationship with a lot of people and we're part of their media mix. It's just like it's different to commercially. I'm interested in growing share, but
in a broader sense, we know that RT and Sputnik have been growing. They buy share. Yeah. We know that CGTN buy share. So the fact that you may be reaching more people for a minute a week on social media, interspersed with other things. I mean, that's a good thing, but it doesn't tell us we're winning any battle.
Yeah, but there's some things we can't know. And without spending a lot of money on market research, we can't know the demographic share in every market. We sample year by year as part of the GAM. There's one point about the GAM, by the way, on the 10-second point. If you come more than once a week, you still only count once. And if you come to English and your local language, you only count once. So the number of people who are coming at any one time is significantly more than the 418 million would suggest, because you can only ever count once.
Let's just lock the point, because I agree that my head was more, if I'm honest, about local media, all those things. I think when you look at the market we're in, with those other players and often bad actors, I think our reach and share or volume of consumption is critical to monitor. They are important metrics.
Last question for me, if the chairman will allow me. I suspect that the value of the World Service to this country and to freedom and peace around the world is huge. How do you prove it? Do you feel you have compelling metrics that can demonstrate to the FCDO, but actually more broadly, in a sense, to the Western Alliance, and we're in a new sort of geopolitical phase now. There are some things that different countries can bring to the table that others can't. Do you have that value story?
Critical question.
Yes, it is a really critical question. I think the answer is yes, in a world of imperfect statistics. So if you look, for example, at trust, which I think we discussed earlier this morning as part of the earlier question and answer session, the BBC's trust score for the World Service globally is rated at about 78% currently. Now that compares to 70% for CNN, 70% for Al Jazeera, 62% for CGTN, though rising because of their presence in the world.
It's worth saying those figures out loud again, if you don't mind. The trust figure in the Chinese state broadcast and the trust figure in Russia today. Could you say them again?
So I've got two figures, one for 2021 and one for 2025. So this is the growth story of those two enterprises. So CGTN in 2021 was at 62%, it's now at 70%, so it's gone up 8% in that year, and that's about investment in markets. And a similar pattern, but more in Russia. So RT gone from 59% in 2021 to 71% in 2025. So that's quite a stark increase in those state actor trust scores. We are stable. We've gone from 77 to 78, so it's within margin of error. It's really stable, and I think that's a good.
The order of magnitude. Those numbers are the same, right?
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Thank you very much, Damien. I want to follow David. I want to follow Jonathan Damien's question on digital, and it's this: you said very clearly that the switch to digital is different in different parts of the world. I just wonder whether in your cost savings plans some of your assumptions were ahead of the curve. You overestimated the BBC's ability to persuade people to switch to digital. And one of the recommendations in the report is that you should conduct more audience research in these countries to work out what the switch is likely to be. And I wonder whether, in fact, your cost savings programs weren't as effective as they should have been, is because you underestimated this or overestimated this switch to digital.
I start. We monitor so regularly the markets that we operate in terms of their digital maturity. So that's, yes, it's internet penetration, but it's looking at competitors, often the state broadcaster as well as commercial broadcasters and online media. So we're looking really kind of carefully at those markets. But there are also measures that we look at where things can turn very quickly. So data costs is a really big one. And for a long time, data costs in many of our markets are prohibitively high and means mass consumption is not going to be possible, particularly on video. So obviously the more data you use in terms of either an app or a site or on video rather than on text. So these things are really carefully monitored and regularly because we need to be there ready when those switches happen. So it is a really fine balance of the digital maturity of the market and the relative investment for the BBC on linear versus digital. So the answer to your question is, were we at exactly the right point in all of those markets? No, probably not, because it is an inexact science. But the effort that goes into trying to predict that and watch those trends in some countries and what it might lead to similar markets around the world, we do.
You can see where I'm going. You overestimated in the past. Are you still going to be overestimating in the future in some parts of the world?
I think we would apply the same criteria and the lessons that we've learnt in other places. So, I think the the value of the data and the, as Jonathan says, it's imperfect, but there's a lot of it. So, for me, one of the things that we've talked about, and Jonathan's mentioned it today, is where we have come off linear, and if it was the right time to do it, and Arabic radio is the one that we are often asked about. It was impossible for us to predict at that point what was going to happen at the terrible events of October the 7th and the devastation of Gaza afterwards. So would we have done it in retrospect? No. But at the point that we decided it, we had looked at both the Arabic and the Persian audience. I'll take Persian as an example here, where the Persian service has a very strong television channel, and it has an incredible digital offer and market. We reach 1 in 4 people in Iran at this critical time. It's a impressive statistic. The radio that they had was taking some resource, but between only 1 to 2% of that audience in Iran was only consuming radio. Many people who were consuming radio were already consuming on their mobiles, digital as well, the site or social. So where we have to make difficult choices, we are going to make the choices that is going to protect as many audiences as possible, but invest in the digital future.
Thank you very much.
I add the point, Chair, just for context in terms of the choices that Fiona mentions. It's true in almost all cases that making television or radio is more expensive than doing digital journalism. So we talked about Polish earlier as a headcount of 4 people. That's the smallest service we've got. But some of the other services, Vietnamese, for example, is only just a few more than that as a digital-only service. The moment you start television studios, camera operators, all that sort of side of television, the mechanics of making television, you put your cost base up. Now, that is not necessarily the wrong thing to do, but it does require a bigger return on that investment because the investment itself is bigger. So in a scenario where the budget envelope is tightening every year because of the licence fee squeeze and all the things we talked about earlier this morning, choices are inevitable. We have to make selections. Not all of them will be perfect with retrospect, and we totally accept the NAO's point about learning the lessons as we go along in that regard.
And just hesitated whether to ask you this or not, but Fiona, how are you getting on with your representations to the United Nations about the oppression of your reporters in Iran?
Well, thank you for bringing it up. It's a massively concerning, evolving, worsening picture for our colleagues in the Persian service. It's just over 100 people. Some have been tried in absentia. Some have had their houses, there have been sanctions against them, financial sanctions against them. Some have had their families brought in for questioning. There is just a constant harassment. And I worry now with what is going on in terms of those protests and in terms of Persian being so crucial in the BBC's reporting of that. And I don't know if anybody's managed to see the news this morning. There's a tracker which BBC Persian and BBC Verify have been working on together, which shows the spread of the protests, the size of them, the scope, what's behind them. It's a really impressive piece of journalism if you get a chance to look at it. So we are talking to the UN and talking to many other journalist organisations about it. I would say we still need to bring it up. We need as much representation as we possibly can, and any help that the members can give us, we were very grateful for. It's not the only service that is under pressure like this. 7 of our Russian service have been named as foreign agents. We have difficulties in the Horn of Africa. We have difficulties in many of our services. It is a worsening situation, not just for press freedom, but for the targeting of journalists, the ability for people to try to get at the BBC through our journalists.
As I say, we think we've got about 300 people living in exile at the moment who cannot go home because the pressures, I spent quite a lot of time with the Persian service and providing the support. I really welcome the question. We just need to be vocal about it and very clear. And give support. I think the team are doing a really good job of giving support, but it is sobering. It's sobering and growing, and the threat levels are growing, and I think we should all be clear about it. Can I just do one, if I may, I know we don't want to go too far backwards, but the data set is a really important question as we make the case for whether this thing should get more money or not. I think we do have an imperfect data set. We have an incredible data set on return investment in terms of efficiency. We can debate the quality of some of the documentation or whatever, but that's good. We have a really compelling set of data that's sitting. I mean, you've got this situation where others are investing hard, cleverly as well, by the way. They're not just, it's not just pure propaganda in the way it appears. It's smart. Therefore, people trust it. They see it. So that the overall trust metric is one thing, but let's get underneath it. And what we've got quite a lot of really important data on how people perceive the UK democracy. I won't go through all the numbers, but we've got a lot of that attitudinal data. I'm being open. Attitudinal data sometimes is quite hard to invest against. Yeah, because it requires you, I think, to say we can see we've got a long-term strategic threat in how people think about the UK, the West, and how I think there's a huge topic we want to think about, which is this idea of how people are thinking about the West, the UK. Are we all equal? They're all as bad as each other? Well, we don't believe that in terms of free reporting, the way we work. The attitudinal data is overwhelming and can be mapped in terms of where the world would be in 10 years if we withdrew and didn't have these types of services. We can also map, I think, the attitudinal impact of how the UK would be perceived if we exited. And it's not good. Yeah. And so I think that data set is really compelling. It's sometimes you're in a and this committee knows you're in a debate where you've got immediate funding requirements of funding something bricks and mortar or immediate. I think this is a strategic investment. That's where the data set sits. I've thought about it a lot, which is how could you improve that data set? But I think that's what it is, and we all have to say we understand it, we believe it, and this is what we want to invest in.
Tim, can you let us have a note on that data set?
Yeah, we've got it. Absolutely. We can give you some of the data that we've got that is very clear, and I think we can share that absolutely, totally. We'd like you to have it.
Thank you. Sir John Whittingdale, please.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, on that point, since I'm also participating in the FAC inquiry into disinformation, any breakdown about how RT and CGTN
we'll do a bit on
have
this.
achieved
Very
such
good.
an extraordinary level of trust is
Make sure it's shared, but otherwise...
I'd be very keen to see. I mean, you've talked about the courage of your journalists in a number of places where it's very difficult, and we absolutely recognise that. But there is one service which has caused me and a lot of people concern, as you know, and we've discussed it before, and that is BBC Arabic. Trust, as you say, is absolutely critical, and yet, two reports, one by the former controller in BBC and a former governor in BBC, detailed what they saw as frequent examples of bias against Israel on the reporting of the conflict there, and then Michael Prescott's note to the editorial, to the board following discussions in the EGSC. He suggested that Jonathan, you particularly, had been dismissive of David Grossman's reports of where bias was occurring, and said that there wasn't a problem. Michael Prescott's report says there is a systemic bias within the BBC that has to be addressed. Could you just say something, because that is clearly going to affect trust?
Before Jonathan responds, I just want to say, we all understand the seriousness of the most important thing the BBC needs to do is deliver on its editorial guidelines and be trusted. We've all got the same intent on that, and we must deliver an impartial service. That's what we must do. We're also not perfect, and we make mistakes. So it's really important that we recognise that and we address them. I would say, with regard to Arabic, we are taking some actions, and Jonathan and we were taking them before the Prescott report, and we've implemented things which I think, if you look at, I'm very proud of the many people working in the Arabic service are doing an outstanding job. We should be proud of the reporting we're doing, but we have fixed issues, and Jonathan can talk about those. I just note that Michael Prescott did say in his evidence to the CMS committee that he didn't believe the BBC was institutionally biased. Yeah? So I think we're all committed to the same thing here. We have recognised some issues. The team are doing an incredible job, I think, under really tough circumstances, but we had improvements to make, and we've made them, and we monitor it very closely. Now, Jonathan can give you detail on that.
Happy to do that. Thank you for raising it. And I'm not defensive or dismissive, I hope, but it's you for you to judge. And let me outline the position as I see it. First of all, I think we all recognise that covering Gaza is covering the most polarising international story of our generation. It's an extraordinarily difficult story, and finding the impartial space is hard because impartiality is a perception. It's not a science. And people come to it with different perspectives depending on their starting points, and that's perfectly natural. I think Michael Prescott, who, as you say, Sir John, sat on the EGSC as an external advisor to the BBC, identified 3 items specifically that he was concerned about. To put that into context, there were 11,000 online articles by BBC Arabic from October the 7th, 2023 to the end of last year. Now, 3 may not be the sum total of things he had a problem with, but it's a very, very small sample of journalism, which was incredibly closely scrutinised by people who were looking at the tone and nature of coverage. That is not to say at all that we are in any way complacent about the strain on the team in covering this story and the support they need to get this story right day in, day out. It is primarily important. It is absolutely grade A important. So let me run you through as a committee to help you with some of the things that we've done at the BBC to give more support to teams and to call out more clearly where we think there's improvements to be made. The first thing refers back to a point I made earlier, which is that I felt that as a result of earlier restructures, there wasn't a clear enough line management accountability, so we've changed that. We changed it way before the Michael Prescott report, by the way. We put in a regional director who's a specialist in the Middle East and an Arabic speaker. We've put in a head of service for Arabic, which unifies television, radio and digital. They were separately managed in previous structures, which I didn't favour because of that accountability point I made earlier. And for the World Service as a whole, we've brought in a new head of editorial standards and quality who is an Arabic speaker and was recruited partly because he is an Arabic speaker. And he's working very closely. He's an excellent, very experienced colleague with global experience, working very closely with Arabic leadership to ensure that they're fit for purpose in all regards, most particularly in training. There's a whole new training program being rolled out. It started late last year, again before the Prescott memo was leaked to the papers. That was already underway. Specifically on a couple of the points in the reports to the EGSC, I think they made a valid point about the newspaper review, which was a daily part of content, so we've overhauled that and changed it. I think there were some valid points about the coverage around the first anniversary of October the 7th, so October the 7th, 2024, when there was some very good journalism around the BBC, but not all of it surfaced on Arabic, and we've put in measures to ensure that that has changed. And the second anniversary, and at that time, of course, hostages were still being held. It was still a very live story. I think we were materially better as a result of that. So all of those things have been done. They've not all been triggered by the EGSC, although the reports to the EGSC were helpful in making sure that what we were doing was right and we got the measures that we wanted in place in the right frame. And we've made some tweaks and adjustments until then. But I do think it's important that we all recognise, and I want to make a case to you today as members of the committee with an interest in this issue, that BBC Arabic is doing an incredible job on radio, television, online without being allowed access to Gaza. It's reporting it all remotely. That is not for the want of trying. We have tried endlessly to get into Gaza, and we're only allowed in on Israeli military embeds, which is not free journalism. And I call on the Israelis again to let us into Gaza so we can report this story from the ground in Gaza in the way we are allowed to do in Israel.
Do you want to talk about contributors and
Yes,
social
of
media
course.
activity?
Yes,
Because
of
on
course.
our list, we've also taken, and I think you'll have seen a change
Yep.
in terms of just making sure we've got full grip of that issue.
Yes.
Because I think the team have done some good work in terms of that area.
So rolling news platforms are hungry for contributors. People to come on the air and talk about something they know about or something they've witnessed or whatever, and that happens all the time on all sorts of stories. But clearly in the Gaza story, in the case of BBC Arabic, it's certainly right and a perfectly fair critique that some people were allowed on air whose background views were egregious. People who, for example, celebrated the Holocaust. That's not an acceptable resting place for the BBC. Now, we were already checking social media back to October the 7th, 2023, to find out what they'd said about the Hamas atrocity against Israeli citizens on that date and subsequently. But as a result of some people coming to light who were interviewed on BBC Arabic platforms who had historical egregious views, we've now overhauled that diligence, and we take that back now to the birth of their social media footprint. Now, we've got very sophisticated tools for doing that, using our colleagues in BBC Monitoring as well as the BBC Arabic editorial team. That is not to ban people necessarily, although it does, of course, raise the bar on the sorts of people we want on the air in a legitimate way to commentate on events. But it is to ensure that they are properly challenged about any views that they've expressed. And, of course, in the most egregious cases, they may be unsuitable to interview at all. I'm very confident that we have a much better system of that vetting. I'm aware of one person who's got through the net, so to speak, in the time since that new vetting process was introduced. That was a mistake of communication about the process of the vetting itself, which we've plugged. Now, the complaints overall have significantly dropped off. Now, of course, there may be another reason for that, which is that the level of the story has dropped away because of the ceasefire is largely holding. So I'm not going to attribute the lack of complaints to, or the drop in complaints specifically to what we've done. But we have more complaints overall in the BBC that we are pro-Israeli than the opposite. So both complaints piles are relatively chunky, as you'd expect from a very polarising story, but it is not the case that everybody thinks that we are leaning in a pro-Arabic, pro-Palestinian way. The opposite is actually true. The majority of opinion, where we can measure it, is that we take a different perspective. For the avoidance of doubt, we don't take any perspective, but in terms of perceptions of the audience, it's important to put that into the discussion.
I mean, you've set out a number of changes to address problems. I mean, do you accept that these problems were being flagged? I mean, going back to the Assassin report, and then by Danny Cohen and Baroness Deach in their report, and then by Michael Prescott in his report internally. And certainly Michael Prescott suggests that the complaints were not taken seriously when they were first made. Do you accept that you should have taken action much earlier?
Well, I think on the Prescott memorandum, all of the issues that he raised in connection with BBC Arabic, and indeed there's some other issues that are not necessarily relevant to the World Service, were discussed and dealt with in the EGSC. We may not have all agreed about the course of action that should have been taken, and he chose to write to the chair of the BBC with his concerns as he stepped down from that role. That's perfectly within his rights. There's nothing wrong with that. But in any editorial process, there are going to be different views about how we achieve the desired goal. And it is often the case that you look back on a set of circumstances and think, well, we could have maybe acted a little bit more quickly on something or other. Of course, that's often right. And I wouldn't demur from that at all. There are some things, that the measures I've just outlined, where I think it is fair to say that some of these things could have been done earlier. There were good reasons why they weren't, to do with the management restructure, which I won't get into too much because it's frankly quite tedious. But if we make an improvement in our processes anywhere in the BBC, it's always a legitimate question to ask, could you have done this earlier? And often the answer to that in any circumstance is, yes, in some cases we could have done.
I bet. Please.
Yes, I'll just
Thank
pick
you, John.
one issue there, then move on to my substantive question. Isn't it the case, in terms of Gaza, that your ability to objectively and fully report on the situation would be greatly helped if the Israelis allowed your journalists in to do that?
Absolutely.
100%.
And we've been clear about that from day one.
We've spent a lot of time with reporters on the border. You've probably seen Jeremy Bowen and Elise Doucette and Lucy Williamson and others standing on the border. And, of course, BBC Arabic colleagues are in the same position as our English language teams. You cannot report any story properly without being there. Eyewitness is the most powerful tool in journalism. And not being able to talk to people directly and experience what they're going through is a serious handicap to reporting any story.
I think it's important just to get that on the record.
Thank you very much.
In terms of the new structure you're bringing in for the new regional structure, where I think the World Service and your other operations are going to be pulled together under regional directors.
Right.
That's been in operation now for a number of months?
It came in on an interim post basis in May,
Right.
so it's not quite a year yet.
Right. Is it working? And if so, how do you know it's working?
Yes, I think, first of all, there are 6 regional directors. Only one of them is permanently in post, but we're recruiting and advertising right now for the others. The other roles are in post, but they're interim. The one that's in post is Africa, where we've appointed an internal candidate who's grown up through the BBC system, started with the BBC and BBC monitoring, and then came into World Service Languages. She's an outstanding, relatively young female African leader. And the idea that is not an improvement on Africa being managed from London, it to my mind doesn't compute. I think that she and her base in Nairobi is going to have an excellent period in growing our African services. She will be supported by a new structure. It's all back office stuff, but new HR, new business protocols, business and operations leadership and finance leadership, which may well address some of the underlying points in the NAO report actually about change programs in the future. And to your point, is it working? It's early days to see metrics in terms of reach or indeed audience demographics, which is one of the things we talked about earlier in response to questions from colleagues. But the ideas flow that we're getting from the regional directors is absolutely inspiring and really positive. To take another example, the regional director for the Americas is currently very heavily involved, as you would expect, in the way the BBC as a whole, including the World Service, is covering events in Venezuela and potential events in Greenland. That single line of accountability, that clarity about who's in charge of the BBC's news operation in those parts of the world is a significant improvement.
So obvious, why haven't you done it before?
That's a question I the change programme that we talked about in context of the NAO report back in 2022 made some management changes driven fundamentally by cost pressures. And I respect entirely the pressures that were on predecessors of mine in that role at the time. They were also against a very, very pressing timeline that the NAO has identified has caused us some problems that we discussed earlier. I don't believe there's any such thing as a perfect structure. But when I walked in and looked at what had been done then, I felt that, to use a little bit of a jargon here, I felt there were too many horizontal roles and not enough vertical roles. And I wanted to look down the system and say, that person is in charge of this bit of the world, and if this bit of the world is going right or wrong, that person is taking the credit or the blame, so that there's accountability. We took a little time to work out how we could do that on a cost-neutral basis, because we took out some management jobs that were based in London and were spanning the world in different functions, and we were still a couple of roles short. So we had to work out how do we do that, because for reasons we just discussed, we can't keep inflating our prices and our costs in leadership or in any other function, and that took us a little while. But I am really pleased with the model. We've got some way to go in terms of maturing it down, and that will require permanent appointments. So the next appointment will be in Asia Pacific, based in Bangkok, and then in Delhi for South Asia, and then we'll move westwards to
I wish we'd done this sooner. I mean, to your point, Chair, it's a good question, but many things in life we feel that, don't we? When we and I think it's just, I'm a big believer in single point of accountability and leadership. I mean, you can talk process, but if you haven't got the right leader in place, whether it's a school, a football team, or a division of the BBC, it doesn't work. So I think what Jonathan's done is right. And often it was a bit... often we're all inheriting history, but often you go on the ground and there's the World Service, there's the other news bit, there's news gap, there's all kinds of... So having a leader that we say, okay, exactly as Jonathan said, how are we covering the Americas? I think it's a real step forward for us, actually. And getting outstanding people in those jobs, which we've got, I think... They're fantastic jobs as well, by the way. Great jobs.
In terms of the finances, this enable you to deliver the savings you already plan to make, or is it going to lead to extra savings and extra costs?
The point that Jonathan was given the brief by myself and the other team that we could inject these leadership roles, but he would have to find the savings elsewhere, so it's cost neutral. So it's cost neutral.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, thank you. So it's cost neutral. They then can look. I mean, I think these executives are pretty well placed to look at where you make savings, where you invest, and literally run the place in a way that I think gives us more control and grip across savings and investment, frankly.
It's cost neutral to deliver a better service with the possibility of more cost effectiveness in future.
Ideally, yes. I think the cost neutrality is an important starting point for the structure. We weren't going to invent more and more and more management posts, clearly in this environment. I think there'll be parts of the world where their objective of growth is easier to deliver than other parts of the world. And that's to do with the market conditions. It's to do with the competition and the editorial space. You know, I've been quite a few times recently to Delhi for various structural reasons, and the market there is very saturated, but there is a real opportunity for the BBC to grow its footprint in India. It's our biggest single regional market outside the UK. It's a reach of about 80 million or so a week. But the population of India, as you know, is well over 1 billion. So it's a small proportion of the population. We want to grow that. Having a leader in India who understands that market is surely a better way of pulling that lever than having a leader in London who is remote from that market. And that's really the objective.
I mean, we've worked really hard to get the number of senior leaders as a percentage of our population down to a tiny amount. So I'm not moving on that. I want to see that go only one way in terms of spans of control and everything. So there's no way we're putting in another 6 senior leaders without working really hard to get the saving. The other element here is worth saying that something like in the US, where we've got .com working, where we're investing and looking at a subscription layer and other things, is this does allow you, in terms of news, working with BBC Studios and others, to say, okay, where there's commercial opportunity, we should take it. Now, if we're all sitting with some investment capital, the news business may not be top of our list, but what I would say is certainly there are opportunities, and economies like India, and for the long term, offer really interesting opportunities in terms of how you could begin to monetize our factual content, working with. So I don't think there's a pot of gold there, by the way, but there's definitely a way in which we could, where you've got the right market, you haven't got a democratic deficit in the way. You're never going to do that in Afghanistan, or I say never, but not for some time, or in the Persian service. But there are ways in which we can then coordinate the BBC and help our finances in that way as well.
In the last few minutes, you did say you were not shackled in the way that you were. You also said at the beginning that that we were at a critical point, you felt, for the BBC World Service.
Yeah.
We haven't heard a lot about other actors this morning, China and Russia. Do you just want to say something about the environment that the BBC World Service is operating in?
I will let Jonathan speak because he's got some of the detail of this, but I think we are we definitely have. I spoke about it earlier. We are in a position where there is a battle for who owns the narrative, the storytelling, and underpinning that is a battle around values, and misinformation and disinformation is utterly rife. I mean, the zone is flood. I said I used the words that they're flooding the zone. We have bad actors deliberately trying to affect the mindsets of populations domestically and internationally, and they're predatory, and they're active, and they're investing, and they're playing a very long-term game. They are not constrained often by the democratic cycle. They are playing over decades to reshape the way people think about the West, the UK, and we have an asset here that is proven to affect the situation in terms of how people think about the UK, how they think about truth and misinformation. For all our problems, and boy, I've lived them, is you can see us struggling where we make a mistake, we recognise it, we debate it, we talk about it. We are open, transparent about that. That is something I think we should be fighting for, and it requires investment. Now, the interesting thing is, and I take Mr. Lowe's point about efficiencies, but you cannot close off all the current distribution costs and just go online, because I think that's too risky, because you lose a lot of reach in that way. So you've got to keep both plates spinning on distribution. In order to do what I think we should be doing, the cost for the UK in the round is relatively small. Now, I'm conscious this is household budgets under the most enormous pressure. So I understand the implications. It's enormous. The pressure is, and we're paying public money, and it's precious. But we know, for instance, that currently we're spending about 300 or 400 million on this service. If we spent 600 or 700 million, we could double the impact. We could see, imagine 1 in 10 people are getting a service from the BBC with the qualities we demand of ourselves in forums like this. Imagine we could do that. And I know that when you get to departmental budgets, the frameworks are incredibly tough. I think we've got brilliant people working through all those dilemmas. But when you step back from it, I think it's a short-term decision not to invest properly while holding us to account on efficiency, by the way, brutally, to all the questions, holds to account on it.
Have you ever considered?
But we should be investing in this service, and I absolutely think we should be investing aggressively in it, because otherwise we are going to lose a position of strength that is essential not only to the UK but also to global democracy. I really believe that. The stakes in my lifetime have never been higher.
Have you ever modelled the possibility of the World Service becoming a subscription service? That ultimately would give you a very good view of who's prepared to pay for it, even if it was a very minimal charge.
Yeah, but we're always looking, like we've launched a subscription layer in news in the US, as BBC.com.
I mean, globally, because you're talking about India and you're talking about other countries that are getting quite rich.
We cannot see. I would love if you could present. I'm ready to go into the
I ask you whether you do you think about it and discuss it.
We're always looking at that, but the problem with that is the news. A subscription news business, by definition, would be of a completely different shape in terms of its content, because you inevitably become click-based in a way that we shouldn't be. I cannot see models in most of the economy where we've got democratic deficits and all the things, that there is a subscription news business that could work in this way. I mean, honestly, I can't see it. We've looked at, we're aggressive commercially. No one in the world has got a 2 billion commercial arm with an EBITDA margin that is pretty good, cash return not bad. The news business, if you can show me any semblance of economics that would do two things. One is maintain your reach, because that is what we're trying to do. What I'm talking about, I'm all for a discussion about the commercial BBC globally and how we can return that. But in news, that would radically affect your reach. Radically affect your reach. It's not whether you could make a model work, it's whether in the end of it you'd be 2% of a population. We have an incredible business in the US called BritBox. Incredible business. In terms of the asset value is immense. We built it from nothing, but it's got 4 million US subscribers. It's wonderful, but it's only 1% of the the US 1 point whatever percent. If you want, it's a different discussion, which is if you move subscription, you'll kill the reach.
Well, there is the argument.
You'll kill the reach.
You
give me one subscription model that has got the reach we've got. And China and Russia are not moving to that model, by the way. They will not be moving. We would just be irrelevant very quickly.
So, as a huge fan of the World Service, and I know you've got other fans around this table, I think you've given us an enormous amount of your time and knowledge this morning. We are very grateful to all three of you. We will digest that in the coming weeks, and we will produce a report. The uncorrected version of the transcript will be available in the coming days. But again, my huge thanks to you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your support, everyone.
Thank you.
Good discussion.